Welcome to station WEFUNK.
Oh, is that the new book?
Yeah.
Oh, right. Well, welcome to the second day of the 2024 American Gem Trade Association Tucson Elevated Seminar Series, sponsored by the American Gem Society, pioneering the American faceting movement. Justin Prim is an American lapidary and gemologist living and working in Lyon, France. He has studied gem cutting traditions all over the world, as well as attending gemology programs at GIA and AIGS. Justin has taught gemology and gem cutting at AIGS and IGT in Bangkok, and he has recently published his first book, The Secret Teachings of Gem Cutting. He is the founder of Faceting Apprentice, an online gem cutting school, and he also writes articles, produces videos, and gives talks about gem cutting history. And that's what we're here to hear today. This afternoon, Justin will take us on a journey through time. Using archival photos and documents, Justin is going to talk about the American gem cutting from the 1890s through the Great Depression through 2 world wars, and the creation of lapidary clubs all over North America. This is previously untold. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Justin Prim.
Thank you. You're good at that. Hello. Can we get some PowerPoint action over here? Thank you. So, just a little introduction to this talk. Last year, a year ago, I spent the entire year traveling around America with my wife and my dog, and we went to every single mine in the country. We went to every gem cutting locality. We met as many gem cutters as we could. We went through all the old documents, through all kinds of libraries and museums and everything else to work on this research. And this talk is kind of what's come out of it. It's eventually going to turn into a book, but for today, it's one experience for you guys to have as I'm going to take you on this journey through time. So if you don't know me already from that great introduction, my name's Justin Prim. I'm originally from Chicago, but as he said, I now live in France. And I'm a gem cutter, as you may have seen if you were just at my faceting demo, but I also have taken a passion towards looking at the history and compiling the history and trying to understand how did we get to the point where we are today in the world of gem cutting. As he said, I wrote a book, The Secret Teachings of Gem Cutting. This is one of the ways that I've been able to share some of the information that I found, looking at all these different cuts from history and talking to all these different cutters from all over the world and trying to really put together a compilation of the essential gem cuts. And when I have the opportunity and the time, I will actually stay with those cutters for sometimes a day, a week, a month if I can, and actually learn their techniques, video what they're doing, and really write down what's happening in all these different studios. Because when we look at gem cutting all over the world, it's similar, but it's different everywhere we go. And one of the reasons why I really like this talk and this story, the American tradition that's grown up from the 1890s is so very different than every other part of the world. It's a really unique story, and I'm really happy to be here to tell it. And yes, we are also teaching gem cutting. So I want to take you on an adventure through time. We're going to go back all the way to the beginning of the American story. Now, the story of faceting starts much, much earlier than today's talk, but we don't want to do all that. I want to put us right into America's Industrial Revolution. So the adventure that I'm going to take you on today, we're going to start with what was happening before the American gem cutting movement began. How was gem cutting coming from the old world into the new, and what was going on at the end of the 19th century? From there, we're going to look quickly but thoroughly at the lapidaries of Maine. This is really where the story begins, where miners want to start to learn how to cut, and we're going to see a lot of really interesting stuff about these early cutters in the 1880s. From there, we're going to see the lapidary movement spread across America up until the late 1920s. And then once we get into this period of the Great Depression, surprisingly, that's when things really take off. And I'm going to show you exactly what happens all across the country while all kinds of other crazy stuff is going on. And finally, to close it out, we're going to look at transitioning from this period of everything being a sort of a DIY, self-made movement to something that turns into bigger, mass-produced, more money, more technology. And of course, more technology comes from all of the things, developments that are happening around us, which includes World War I, World War II, and the aftermath of that with the technology that comes with it. So that's what I want to talk about today. Sounds like a lot, but it's going to be fun. So before we get into the story, I always like to look at it this way, because America is a big, big place and things are happening all over the country. So as I go through the narrative, we're going to jump around from place to place. As I said, we're going to start with some of these main cutters where a lot of activity is happening because we've got a mine up there, but there's a lot of stuff happening down the East Coast. You know, we've got a lot of influential people and institutions, and they're going to play their part. But Southern California also is a really big place where we've got more mines and more people that are getting interested in cutting. So we're going to jump between the coasts as well as going up to the Pacific Northwest, where we've got a couple of really important people running an important magazine in Portland, Oregon, and then a couple of outliers. We've got a very interesting and important guy in Indianapolis, as well as one of America's first pioneer cutters down in Greenville, South Carolina. So we're going to really be bouncing all over the country, and it's kind of interesting because the story of American cutting doesn't just happen in one place. You know, it's not just New York, it's not just Los Angeles, it's really a bit of every place, and it has to do with mining, it has to do with the industry and everything in between. So let's begin. So if we really want to understand American gem cutting, we have to understand where does it come from? What was going on before there was such a thing? And we need to look to Europe to figure that out. We see cutters from Europe. This could be cutters from London, cutters from France, cutters from Germany, coming over as immigrants and settling here and bringing their techniques and their technology with them. So if we're looking at this period before the 1880s, which is really where it all begins, you know, going all the way back to even the beginning of the 1800s, the only type of gem cutting that we're going to find is something that looks like this. Now this is a guy, this is probably one of the last guys of this generation. This is the beginning of the 1900s in New York. And if you know anything about gem cutting machines, which I'm not expecting that you do, you would notice that he's using a distinctly British machine. It's this one that comes right out of the encyclopedia. We can find this in 1876 in an American encyclopedia, but we can find the same machine going all the way back to 1840 in a London encyclopedia. So this is a hand-cranked gem cutting machine. So he's got his left hand here cranking this thing, and he's got this little wooden pegboard where he sticks a stick in there and puts it against the lap, and that's how he's getting his angles. It's very simple, very crude. It's very old-fashioned by today's standards, but at this time, this was the only type of gem cutting. This is a very European tradition that's come here. And when we're thinking about a new era being born as American gem cutting, not only are we going to see a change in technology, but there's an aesthetic difference that we can notice almost from the beginning. When we look at all the stones that were coming out of Europe at the end of the 1800s, or even today, what we pretty much exclusively find is the mixed cut. Whether it be round like this one, or an oval, or a pear, it's always looking pretty much the same. A brilliant cut on top, a step cut on bottom, and that is the European passion. Even today, that's what they like to cut, that's how they like to do it. But almost immediately when we see gem cutters who are, you know, born and bred in America starting to cut on their own machines, they immediately want to try and do something different, which is the full brilliant. So this is just to compare, this is a full brilliant amethyst from about 1930, and we can see the stereotypical 8 points that go into the middle, just like a kind of a diamond cut. Now this is something that was never ever done in Europe, and even in today it's still never done in Europe. It's a really American way of doing things. And so when I started to research the story, I really wanted to understand, where does this come from? Why did America already from the beginning have this new cutting aesthetic? And I was able to find some pretty good evidence of when it began. So we've got this book from 1903. This is Precious Stones by W.R. Cattell. And he's got a very interesting passage where he says that there's a gem cutter in Boston named Mr. Edwin Passmore, and he has succeeded in preserving the color and enhancing the brilliancy of many fancy stones by cutting them entirely brilliant. So 1903, this is a totally new idea. We're going to take a colored stone and we're going to cut it in the same way that we do a diamond, fully brilliant. And it says, This gentleman has done for colored stones what Henry D. Morse did for diamonds. Now, if Henry D. Morse doesn't sound familiar to you, he's the guy that pioneered what we today would call the old European cut. Round, brilliant, with a modern proportion, made right in Boston, Massachusetts. So this is a very American style of cutting. Sorry, not the old European cut, like the modern round, but the early 1900s modern round. So this is in comparison to the old European cut. So he's transforming the diamond industry by new proportions, new angles, getting everybody excited. And when the American cutters hear about this, the colored stone cutters, they want to emulate this. Now, diamond cutting and colored stone cutting is a completely different world. So it's kind of interesting that the colored stone cutters would even know about all these tips and tricks from the diamond industry. But the thing was, when Henry Morse changed the diamond industry, he didn't do it secretly. He didn't even do it quietly. If you look in publications from this period of time, there are so many ads and sort of propaganda flyers like this showing we've developed something new. It's the best of the best. We're using the most latest technology with the most latest understanding of gemology and optics and polishing and creating something that's truly world-class and truly American. So when this cut came out, they would call it the American cut, the scientific cut, and you'd see all this kind of stuff, the best cut that science can make. And if we think about the period of time, this is the period of time that's also given us electricity, the car, eventually the radio and telecommunications. So this is the birth of that period, and everybody as a culture here is very, very excited and interested in all this new stuff. So you can imagine that if you're a gem cutter who's just wanting to learn to cut at this moment, and this is the kind of stuff that you're seeing, it makes it seem like the brilliant cut is the ultimate best. And it really worked for the American audience. Even today, 100 years later, the brilliant cut is the essential standard cut for all American gem cutters. And it's very rare, even today, that you will see somebody doing one of these sort of old world mixed cuts. Today, everything in America is brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. And we can trace that all the way back to Henry Morse and these early diamond cutters that were doing this, modern style of scientific cutting. So let's talk about colored stones. Let's see, where does it all begin? And if we want to do that, we need to go up to Maine. So why Maine? There's a very specific reason. Maine has the oldest mine for colored stones in America. So this is Mount Mica. They're producing tourmalines, some very, very beautiful tourmalines. Even still today, this is a mine that is still alive. But if we go back to the late 1800s, so this mine's been going since the 1820s, so it's much older than my story. But if we go to the caretakers of the mine in the 1880s, we're going to see this guy right here. This is Loren Merrill. So Loren Merrill is the mine owner in the late 1800s. His partner Kimball Stone, they've gotten together. They have the mining rights, and they've been mining and sending those stones down to New York so that those gem peg cutters can cut them and send them back up, and they're selling them as cut stones. At some point during the late 1800s, Merrill decides he's not really happy with the cutting that's coming out of New York. Whether it's the polishing, whether he feels like they're losing weight or charging him too much, or maybe he wants to cut them in full brilliant like all of these other American guys, and these old school cutters in New York who are from London don't really want to do it. Could be one of any of these things, or maybe all of them. But eventually, Merrill decides that he's going to do it himself. He's going to learn how to cut stones. So he goes down to New York, and he tries to figure out what they're doing. He asks the cutters there, "Can you give me some tips?" And they say, "No way. You're a miner, you do that, we're the cutters, we'll do this, and we'll keep it friendly like that." But he's not happy with this, so he decides to invent something totally new. So Merrill's a clever guy. He knows how to work with metal a little bit. He's got a lot of other skills besides just mining. And so he puts together this machine right here. And if you've ever seen a gem cutting machine, this one doesn't look anything like anything you've ever seen because it's really, really different. He's got a big arc here, and he's got all these little sticks with basically what you can imagine as like a tinker toy gear on it, and he is foot power pedaling this machine so that he can use both hands at the same time to be able to cut some of these very, very early American stones. Now, I was really, really interested in Lauren Merrill and this whole story of Maine. And so last year I was able to go up there and really kind of explore the mine, explore the area. And amazingly enough, Lauren Merrill's machine that he built maybe as early as 1888 still exists. It's still in the Historical Society up there, which is actually right across the street from where we used to live. So it's not traveled very, very far since 1888. And so we got to go and see. And this is what it looks like today. You can see that big metal arc, though quite rusty today. He's got his lap on here. He's got all these little holes inside of this wooden cog. And as he turns the holes around, it aligns the stone up with those little holes. And that lets him put the facets exactly where he wants to be. Because if he wanted to cut the way that those gem peg cutters down in New York were doing, that's a very, very simple yet difficult technology. It's very, very crude, which means if you haven't practiced on it for 3, 4, 5 years, you're not going to be able to do anything. Now, Merrill's a miner. He knows he doesn't have time to go do an apprenticeship for 5 years at age 40. So he's thinking about, how can I use technology? How can I use my brain and make something that's going to help me do what those guys have spent years figuring it out? And this is what he does. It's basically gears and angles, and he's creating a mechanism to do the work that the hands of those other guys are doing, because he doesn't have the skills to be able to do it. So he's the first guy in America to ever do this, and really he's the first person in the world to ever do this, because we've never seen a sort of index-based rotational gear like this anywhere else in the history of gem cutting. And this is a 500-year history, so this is quite interesting that he's doing something that nobody's ever thought to do before. So he builds this machine, and he's now mining and cutting his own stones. In the small area around Paris, Maine, which is where the mines are at, he becomes quite interesting and popular. And unlike the European traditions of keeping everything secret and not telling the tips and the tricks and sharing the technology, he's very, very open. He wants the other people in the community to know how to do this. He trains some people, they build more machines, and suddenly within 10 or 20 years you've got a dozen cutters up in small town Maine who are sitting there all day cutting local tourmalines. So we've got guys like Martin Keith and Knox Bickford who are using the exact same type of machines that Lauren Merrill were using, the big arc with the angle thing and the foot power. So they're up in the country. Portland, Maine is really the middle of nowhere. And if we go down to the capital, Paris, Maine. If we go down to the capital, Portland, Maine, which is where all of the jewelers of that area are at, we've got this guy, William Cross. Now, William Cross at some point hears about these guys, or maybe he actually meets them as he's probably buying their stones to put in his jewelry. And now William Cross is a jeweler, but he's also a tool maker. He's made all of his own jeweler's tools to do his business, and he's starting to get interested in what these guys are doing. And he decides to make his own version of the machine. So he builds a very small version of what they're doing, and the whole thing is metal now. He upgrades some of the technology and changes it to be a little bit more efficient. So we now already in the first 20 years have like a second iteration or a second version of this early American type machine. Now the main story keeps on going. If we go all the way into the 1920s, all of these guys actually end up getting together as a group. So we've got 2 of the miners, 2 of the cutters, and this jeweler, and they're getting together with a tool maker and building the best of the best of the best by putting all of their heads together, and they eventually come up with this sort of version 3.0 of this main faceting machine that they call the Mercapon, which is basically taking a couple of letters from each one of the main guys' names and building up something that looks slightly more like what we have today. So we have some controls here that are really essential and important. We've got a rotational gear, which we saw before, but now the whole thing's metal. This is helping them turn the stone around and put all the facets exactly where they're supposed to be without a lot of hand dexterity necessary. The second tool or control that they have is this angle thing. So as they turn this arc thing up and down, the angle is going to change, and you've got this little bar that's pointing exactly at the numbers so they can see exactly what angle they're putting on each stone. And this is something that the jam peg cutters and the European cutters never ever had. Even today, the cutters in France and London and Idar Oberstein, they have no idea of the exact angles that they're cutting when they put those facets in, which means if they're not really, really good and really, really experienced, the stones might just not look very good. So the final thing they did was put this height control on here. They wanted the whole thing to be able to go up and down, because if you got a big stone or a small stone, if you don't have the ability to go up and down, you can't find the correct angle, because the stone will actually move the arm and change the numbers. So this third control was the thing that none of them had before, and this is really the revolutionary moment when we've got all three of the controls that we need, which is all the stuff that we have today. Unfortunately for Maine, they're on the extreme northeastern part of America, and they really kind of exist in a bubble. And I don't think that's really different today. When I went up into Maine, I felt like I was entering a different world. So while all this stuff is going on for about 30 years, nobody really ever finds out about it, or at least not for a while. So while this stuff is going on in Maine, we've got some other stuff that's happening in different parts of America. So if we go all the way to the opposite end, down to LA, we've got a small community of gem cutting ideas building up around a couple of jewelry shops. And one of the most important people at this time was this guy named Frank Albion Marcher. So Marcher and his brother had a shop that opened in January 1st, 1900. And their whole idea was you could come into the shop, pick out a loose stone that you liked that was already cut, pick out a setting, and they'd put them together for you right there. And it was really the first time in America that anybody ever came up with this concept of sort of like, you assemble your own design. It was something that people do a lot today. But so what they wanted to do was create this full experience. So when you'd walk into their shop, you would have, it's a big window, and you'd walk in, you got the sunlight coming in, and they've got all the gems lined up in all these little bowls. So when you walk in, you're just bombarded with twinkling colors. So you go through, you pick out which one you want, and then of course they'll find a setting for you. But they wanted to give you even more of an experience than that. So check out what's happening along the wall here. We've got all these fancy dressed gem cutters who are cutting cabs and even cutting faceted stones with this machine, this machine that Marcher developed and patented. So this is the patent for the machine. It's about 1901, and this is the actual machine. Amazingly enough, I was able to find this, and it's part of my personal collection now, but this was one of the earliest types of West Coast, what I'll say West Coast machines. And notice it doesn't really look like that machine in Maine. It doesn't have that big arc, and a lot of the components are different, but all of the controls are the same. They still have this rotating gear, which is really, really important for putting the facets where they're supposed to be. They still have something to tell them what angle they're at, and they still have this lever up here to raise the whole thing up and down. So these three controls are going to continue out this whole story, and they really are one of the defining things that we see in the American style of faceting. Because again, if you look at the European technology, they just don't have this kind of mechanical control system. Everything is really up to the eye and the hand of the cutter. So as we go through this early period of the 1900s, we're going to see this design being reiterated all over the place. So we've got different people making different iterations of the same idea in New York. We've got different people down in Southern California, and they're all riffing on the same idea. So now we've got this little area of Southern California that's starting to build some new machines. We've got people in New York building new machines, and then we've got the people in Maine who started it all and maybe spread some of these ideas around. But even though we've got all this new technology coming in, it's still just a small drop in the bucket of what's really going on, because when we look at the ads of this time, all of the ads and the information that we can find about gem cutting all points back to these same immigrant cutters in New York. And notice one of the bigger cutting houses at the time actually shows a drawing of their cutter in New York City, and he's using a British-style jam peg. We can see that some of the other ads for gem cutters, Maiden Lane, New York, and Maiden Lane. So all of the actual professional cutters who are actually taking in work for the country are all still just these same old school New York cutters. So even though we've got new technology, nothing's changed yet. But that's going to change here in just a little bit. So as we get into the 19-teens, America kind of goes through this interest in earth sciences. And we start seeing all these new magazines pop up, and some of them that already existed, like the American Mineralogist. And we start to see a lot more things being published about gem cutting. America is curious, and they want to know more. So we start to see some important things coming, like, for instance, There's a guy in Indianapolis, he's a chemistry teacher, but he's really, really interested in stones, and so he starts writing for one of the trade publications at the time. It's called A Suggested Course in Gemology. So this is I think it was a 25-part series that went over the course of a year, and every issue he'd give you like a new chapter of what we would think of today as like a part of a gemology course textbook. Eventually he takes all this information and puts it together into his own book called A Textbook of Precious Stones, and even though Wade wasn't a gem cutter, he becomes really important for the story, because as we start to have a gem cutting community develop, they want to know more about gems and the science behind it, and they look to Wade and his brand new 20th century book to figure out what is it about gems and the science and the refractive index and all that other stuff that they need to know to be able to be good cutters. So Wade starts doing a lot of collaboration and correspondence with some of these cutters, as well as guys like Herbert Whitlock, who's the curator of the National History Museum in New York. So he's the gems curator, and so he's also publishing some articles throughout the 19-teens talking about, how do we do the brilliant cut and what does it mean? And it seems like it's going to be a really, really exciting time. Things are kind of bustling, new things are coming out, but then all of that starts to slow down when we enter World War I. So 1917, April 4th, the U.S. decides that they're going to support the war on Germany, and everything kind of stops for a little while. But even though America's at war, we can see that right in the middle of the war, whether it's 1917 or 1918, the headlines aren't really reflecting the crisis that's going on, because according to the New York Times, jewelry sales are still good, and the lapidaries are having trouble supplying demand for their products. So either that the demand is too high or the supply is too low, but one way or another, they're not able to do as much work as they need to do, which tells us that there's still people buying stones and there's still cutters who need to work for them. Now, nothing really happens for a little while, but if we jump about 9 years into the future, we're going to see one of the first publications that specifically looks at what is gem cutting. Now, this is Whitlock's. Again, this is the guy who's curating the History Museum in New York, and so he is writing this pamphlet. So this is like something that you would get in the gift shop of the museum, and he's writing this little pamphlet about the art of the lapidary. And so he goes through, it's not very big, it's about 20 pages, and he goes through and just talks a little bit about what it is, how they do it. Most of it's about diamonds, but he does have one little chapter about colored stones. But when we look and see what he's showing us, it's not those brand new machines from Maine or Southern California. It's the old school jam peg cutters in New York, which makes a lot of sense because Whitlock is in New York, and probably if he goes out and tries to meet a gem cutter, these are the ones that he can find because they're the ones that have advertisements and are letting people know how to find him. So this isn't really a very big, important publication, but just one thing showing us that it's getting a little bit more important and a little bit more interesting, and people want to know, so the museum is responding. Now, in the same year, we do get another publication that actually is quite important and quite big, and this is Rocks and Minerals. So Rocks and Minerals was started by this guy, Peter Zodak, who's in upstate New York. And so in the first issue of the magazine, he explains in the sort of editor's letter why he decided to start this. And he says, "The idea of publishing a magazine devoted to minerals was first suggested to me through the large number of letters I received from collectors and would-be collectors who desired information on the subject, methods in analyzing minerals, hints on making a collection, and so forth. So many letters did I receive, and so keen was their interest that I was oftentimes swamped with correspondence. As a solution, I finally decided a magazine on minerals would be just the thing." So he starts this magazine September 1926, and it's mostly about collecting rocks, collecting minerals, but it starts to become a little bit of a rallying point because it's the first time that we've had a magazine that's not made by scientists, written for scientists like the American Mineralogist. This is made for collectors. It's made for anybody who's interested in rocks, and so it's written in a way that's easily understandable. And so as people start getting more interested in rocks and collecting minerals and going rock hounding, some of those people are starting to think about gem cutting, and they're starting to write into Zodak. And this becomes the first focal point that we have to bring this community together. Unfortunately, before that can happen, the stock market crashes. So I put this in here just so we can understand what's going on in the wider world outside of gem cutting. You know, World War I has just ended. We're starting to recover from that. Things are looking good in the 1920s, and then, of course, it all comes crashing down at the end, right before the 1930s. But despite the fact that the economy is a little bit messed up and people are losing their jobs, it's the perfect environment for something new to be born, and that is our lapidary community. So 2 months after the stock market crashes, we've got this letter that's published in the December 1929 issue of Rocks and Minerals. And we've got this guy who really is, at this point, nobody that anybody ever heard of. Just one random guy in South Carolina, and he's J. Harry Howard. So he writes a letter to the editor that they publish. He said, "There are doubtless hundreds of men like myself who are more interested in cut and polished stones than in raw materials, and who get a kick out of cutting them and polishing them for ourselves. But we don't know how. Can you find someone competent and willing to write such an article to be published in pamphlet form or sold to your subscribers or to be published in the pages of Rocks and Minerals?" So this is kind of interesting because we see that there is sort of this call, this demand. We want to know how to cut stones. We're not just trying to collect the minerals, but there's nobody here to do it. So J. Harry Howard, they publish his letter, and because of that, people start writing letters to the magazine saying, yeah, we want to do that too. We want to do that too. Please let us know. And so then Zodak starts forwarding those letters to J. Harry Howard down in South Carolina, and J. Harry Howard effectively becomes his own sort of focal point for the faceting community, or what will become the faceting community, the gem cutting community. And so we start to see all these letters going back and forth, 1937, 1938, 1937, and we've got people writing to the magazine, people writing to Howard, Howard now writing to some of these other people that he's met. Some of them are in Canada, some of them are on the West Coast, some of them are in the Northeast, and slowly but surely we've got this community that's starting to be formed through letters. And we've got all these letters going across the country. Now, it takes up about 2 years, but by the time we get to 1931, J. Harry Howard has talked to so many gem cutters, or would-be gem cutters, who are doing all these little experiments in their own basements and garages, that by the time we get to 1931, he's accumulated so much knowledge that's being shared through these letters and through his own experiments that he actually puts out the pamphlet that he was asking for. So 1929 says, can you please find someone to put out a pamphlet? 1931, he becomes the guy that puts out the pamphlet. So he's kind of our first lapidary influencer. He's writing letters to everybody, which turns into this pamphlet. They sell like 300 of these, and they sell out in just a few weeks. It's a very popular thing. And inside the pamphlet, it's not very big. Again, it's 30 pages or so, but it's the beginning of something. And he shows us mostly how do we take a stone from our own backyard, make something to turn it into a cabochon. So these guys are really not thinking about faceting yet. The cabochon is already so complicated for them just to get a good polish that anything more complicated than that is too much. And he shows us, all these different ways of doing cabs, sawing, and everything else. And he doesn't really mention faceting until right at the end of the book. There's like a little addendum at the end, and he said, oh, and by the way, there's this other thing called faceting, but it's way too complicated. So don't think about that. Let's just focus on our cabs. But if you were interested, here's what it looks like. And lo and behold, we see not the guys in the Southwest who are building some modern metal things, but these guys up in Maine. And this is really the first time that anybody's ever seen what's going on in Maine. So 1888 to 1931, the bubble of Maine has just been burst, and for the first time everybody can see what does a faceting machine look like. And what they see is this big arc machine that Loren Merrill has developed so that he can cut his Maine tourmalines. So this spreads around a little bit, and because it does so well, Peter Zodak, the editor of Rocks and Minerals, says, hey, Harry Howard, you should write a column for the magazine. And so just a couple months later, we see the first issue that has the amateur lapidary column in the back. So J. Harry Howard really has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. He wanted a pamphlet, he became the guy with the pamphlet. He wanted a column, he became the guy to write the column. So he had to become an expert by communicating with all these other people and then doing his own experiments. But he eventually does become the expert that he was looking for, even to the point where he develops his own type of faceting machine. And we can see already in 1931, this faceting machine is for sale in the back of the magazine. Now, I'm not going to talk about this machine yet because I want to come back to that later. But just so we know that already in 1931, we have our first faceting machine that you can buy out of a magazine, set it up at home, and try to cut your own faceted stones. So as we're moving through the 1930s, we start to get, again, we're in the middle of the Great Depression. People are out of work. Lots of people are moving around because of the Dust Bowl. You know, we got this whole migration of people from the South going to the West. And in the meantime, people are looking for things to do. If they don't have jobs, they have nothing to occupy their time. So it's in the middle of the 1930s, or really throughout the 1930s, that the whole idea of hobbies becomes a thing. We don't really see this word hobbies in America before the 1930s, and it's really people looking for things to do while they don't have anything else to do, but they're looking mostly for things to do that don't cost too much money, because again, people are out of work, they don't have a lot of food, and et cetera, et cetera. So as we go through the 1930s, we start to see this craze for hobbies. It could be card playing, it could be pottery, it could be gardening, or for our story, it could be hobby gem cutting. And so we see a couple of instances where this thing pops up. 3 different issues of the Scientific American, 1932, 1933, 1934, and we're starting to see this amateur lapidary, gemstone cutting for the amateur. The amateur rides a new hobby. So this message and this idea that you could be an amateur gem cutter who maybe goes out into nature and finds a rock, something shiny and pretty, and bring it back home and do it all by yourself at home. And so even Rocks and Minerals is kind of capitalizing on this moment in time. You know, in the middle of the Depression, they're saying, are you short of cash? No problem. All you need to do is buy our magazine, and we're going to show you how you can go out into nature, find your own stones, and we're even going to show you how to cut them with the amateur lapidary section in the back. So this hobby is buzzing and booming, and it's moving around the country, and we start to see some of the first mineralogical clubs being formed. So the first one that we've got is Pasadena. So this is just right outside of Los Angeles, 1931, and so we have this idea that we're going to get together in a group, we're going to go out into nature, and we're going to go and just do some rock hounding. We're going to go out into where the mines are at, we're going to find some stones. And so they took a camera with them, and this is the first meeting that they had, or the first field trip that they did for the first mineral club in America, or at least in the West Coast. So they go out and they're looking for, I assume tourmaline, I'm not totally sure what they were looking for, and they decide, okay, if we're going to start a club, well, we should make a magazine to keep everything organized and to communicate this. So they put this magazine together, and this picture is in the magazine. And if we flip through the magazine to the back, lo and behold, who do we find but Marcher Brothers, those brothers who had the shop in LA, who have their own faceting machine, and all the guys in the cute waistcoats who are cutting gemstones in the shop. So we can see that this new group of interested, scientifically minded people are not totally divorced from the trade. The Marcher Brothers knew about the Mineral Club, and the Mineral Club were probably taking some of the stones that they found to the Marcher Brothers shop and having them cut them. So these guys are really smart. They know that if they put an ad in the back of this magazine, all these new gem-minded people are going to be interested. So this is happening in Pasadena. Now if we go 8 miles north towards the center of LA, we've got Robert Shipley, who's just opened the GIA in downtown Los Angeles. So the whole idea of the GIA was, we're going to take the jewelers, the jewelry sellers, the professional people who are selling jewelry, and teach them a little bit more about the science to make them a little bit more potent, so they really know what they're talking about when it comes to what these stones are. So we know today, we can see, looking back, that Robert Shipley was really smart to do this, because today the GIA is one of the biggest gem institutes in the world. It's not just in California anymore, it's in New York, it's in Bangkok, it's in China, it's everywhere. So he was right on the money doing this. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was, in the first year that they opened, they were already offering correspondence courses. So if you weren't in LA, maybe you're in New York, maybe you're up in Maine at the mine, you can still learn about gemology through correspondence courses. And the same thing still today. I did part of my gemology course with GIA through the same correspondence courses. So really cool to see that that was already going on almost 100 years ago. So as we move through the 30s, we're going to see more and more of these clubs popping up. Some of them are in West Coast, some of them are in the middle in the mountains, and some of them are going to be in New York and the East Coast. Now, one of the most important clubs that gets formed in the 1930s is in Portland, Oregon. We got this guy named Henry Dake. So Dake by day is a dentist. He's working right downtown Portland, doing people's dental work. But nights and weekends, he's getting together with his friends and going out and looking for minerals, thinking about stones, and eventually they start a club, which is the Oregon Agate and Mineral Society. And so their club newsletter is the Oregon Mineralogist. So just like some of the other clubs, they decide doing the magazine is a really good way to let people know what we're doing, to keep the club communicating, and to find new members. But the interesting thing that happens with the Mineralogist is it starts spreading a lot farther than Portland, Oregon. It eventually gets down to California. It eventually gets all the way out to Maine. And it becomes such a popular magazine that they decide that they're going to drop the word Oregon and just turn it into the Mineralogist. And so by the time we get to 1935, the Mineralogist is now our second major magazine that we have for this new community. Rocks and Minerals coming out of New York, and now we've got the Mineralogist coming out of Portland, Oregon. But the cool thing about the Mineralogist was that Dake was a gem cutter himself. He was going out and getting agates and cutting them, and as we're going to see, they start sharing some of these things that they're discovering through the magazine and really help people to learn and share and exchange information. So just like what's going on in Oregon, we've got lapidary clubs and classes popping up all over the country, whether it be in Chicago or Washington, D.C., even into the high schools. We're starting to see some gem cutting classes come in, and it's a craze. It's just going all across the country, and the magazines are really helping to push that. You know, every month you're going to get your new issue of Rocks and Minerals, you're going to get your new issue of the Mineralogist and see what's new, what have people found, what are some new localities that we can go find, and maybe you're even going to figure out what's a new technique for polishing this stone that I found in my own area. So by the time I get to the middle of the 1930s, in comes in, again, J. Harry Howard. So he wrote his pamphlet in 1931. He has his magazine article that's coming out every month. And by the time he gets to 1935, he's accumulated so much knowledge and so much information that he finally finishes the thing that he asked for was, can you please find somebody to write the book? Now, this one is not just a 15-page pamphlet. This is a full-size book. It's about 230 pages, and he goes through every single aspect of lapidary. He's talking about sawing, cabbing, beading, slabbing, and then finally he starts talking about faceting. And so in the book he shows us exactly how to cut a stone. He shows some of the different types of stones that are popular at the time. But maybe most importantly, the coolest thing that he shows is this homebrew faceting machine that he's come up with. And he talks about how do you build one of these? Because remember, we're in the middle of the Great Depression. People don't really have a lot of money, so he doesn't want to say, oh, you have to go and buy this thing out of the magazine. Maybe you already have some of these bits and parts at home. You can just get together an old bench grinder and build this thing out of parts that you can get at the hardware store and make something that you can take a rock that you found outside, mount it together, and facet the stone. And so he tells exactly how to build the whole machine for like $5 in 1935 money. And this is really one of the biggest and first times that a machine is really being shown and spread all across the country, because this is a well-received book. All the lapidary clubs buy it. He's selling it in all the magazines, and anybody who'd want to know about gem cutting is going to find this machine and start to get curious about it. So it spreads around a little bit. Now, this isn't really the type of machine style that we see today. It looks very foreign if you've ever seen a faceting machine, but we do see a couple of different people that are using it, like this one picture from Scientific American in 1934. So even though J. Harry Howard tells us a lot and he teaches us a lot, the type of machine that he shows us is not really the one that starts to dominate the American landscape. If we want to see what's the newest new thing, we need to go back to Portland and see what the guys in the Mineralogists are doing, because they have decided that the gem cutting thing is so interesting that they put together what they call the Mineralogist Gem Cutting Laboratory. So they show this picture off in 1936. We've got all these cabbing machines over here. We've got different kind of grinders. We've got all the abrasive powders that you need. But probably the coolest thing for me is this table right here with this brand new California West Coast style faceting machine. So they show us this in 1936, and this is what really causes a big change, because the The Mineralogist is a big magazine. It's going around to a lot of different interested people, and this really takes us from the era of a homemade machine. We're going to have to do it yourself and build it out of parts from the hardware store to something that you can actually open a magazine and see an ad for it. So the guys at the Mineralogist get really, really into this, and they start reviewing and testing and experimenting with anybody's machine who's being developed. And a lot of them are being developed in their own backyard. Portland, Oregon, and then not too far away in Southern California, the West Coast is really, really popular, and they're showing a lot of this stuff in the magazine. So we got some really early ones like the John's Gem Cutter and the Kleinfelter. Now these are machines that nobody today has ever heard of. They don't exist. You couldn't find them if you wanted to. They've been lost to the pages of history, but we can still see kind of what they were looking at. And one of the biggest things that's happening now is that the lapidary community is getting some recognition from the manufacturers. So we start to see ads like this one in the back of the magazine for Dixon Lapidary. So Dixon Lapidary is actually Dixon Tools. It's a New Jersey company that makes jeweler's tools. But they start seeing that, oh, there's some stuff happening here about the gem cutting. We need to get on this because there's some money to be made. And rightly so, they start making machines, supplies, and tools and showing us some of these different faceting machines that are available, whether there's the modern American one like this, or even still looking at the old school JamPeg machine. Nobody knows what's the dominant style yet. Is it going to be the new modern idea, or maybe the traditional European technique will dominate? We're not totally sure yet, but in the middle of the 1930s, there's a lot of energy around this. New machines, new suppliers, new ideas, and everybody's got their own way of doing it. Some people are doing it, like this. Some people are doing it like this, and everybody's got their own idea, their own way. So as we move forward, more and more curiosity, more and more interest, which means more and more publications. So here we've got Fred S. Young. He's one of the main writers for the Mineralogist up in Portland, and he's that guy who's really running that experimental workshop up in Portland, trying to figure out how can we do our own faceting, how can we figure this out. And so through a couple of years of writing articles and doing experiments, he comes out with this book. Now, so this is our second major book of the American gem cutting story. We've got J. Harry Howard in 1935, and then we've got Fred S. Young in 1938, putting out all the information for people to find. So if you're somewhere in America, or maybe even farther, and you want to learn how to cut a gemstone, for the first time ever in the history of the world, it's available in a book. Instructions, diagrams, pictures, looking at all the different machines. And so this becomes a very, very important book as the community grows. Now, things should just go on and on and on and on, but no, we have to pause again because America enters World War II. Now, World War II is a much bigger and more devastating thing for the American jewelry trade and the American, hobby lapidary trade. Metal is restricted. All the lapidaries in New York get their work turned over to war work. So they're cutting ball bearings and agate burnishers and all these kind of things that they need to do different stuff in the war. So the trade really, really slows down. There's nobody that's going to be making machines in their home at this point because there's just no metal to be had. All of the metal is being allocated for the war. So everything in the hobby community and to some degree in the professional community just kind of goes on pause for a couple of years. And of course, a lot of people are gone, right? A lot of people are going overseas. They're fighting in the war. Some of them are coming back. Some of them aren't. Some of the ones that are coming back, though, are coming back with some new interests because some of the people that were stationed around the world for World War II were going into gem-cutting countries like India and Burma and Sri Lanka and Australia and Brazil, and they've seen gemstones for the first time, as soldiers on their duties, but when they're coming back sort of gem-conscious a little bit. And so when World War II finally does come to an end, we see that the enthusiasm and the curiosity around minerals and earth science, and specifically about gem cutting, it explodes. Also, suddenly now we've had people sitting idle or doing things that they don't really want to do for a couple of years. So when things finally come back and the economy stabilizes and there's metal available again, the 1940s is like a humongous explosion of brand new stuff. If the 30s was really interesting with a couple of books and a couple of new machines that you could buy, the 1940s is like a buffet. We've got so many machines that we can't even keep track of them. Almost every new issue of these magazines is showing off a brand new machine that we haven't seen before, like the Featherweight and the Simplex and the Orcott. Again, these are machines that nobody today would remember. They've been lost to the pages of history. But there are a couple machines that come out of this time, like the MDR and the Graves, which started at the end of the 1940s, and some of them have continued all the way on until today. Graves just stopped making machines like 2 or 3 years ago, so this is an incredible run for a company coming right off the back of World War II. Same with MDR. MDR just stopped making machines in the early 2000s. So these are still machines that people have in their shops today and still use. Now the final part of this story happens at the end of the 1940s. We've got all these new machines coming. We've got a couple of really powerful magazines that are bringing people together and creating this community. But it's not until 1947 where we've got this guy in Southern California called Leland Quick who decides, this is really, really popular, and these mineral magazines that are showing us gem cutting are just not enough. He has the idea that there's so much enthusiasm and there's so much money to be spent in the gem cutting hobby. He decides to start his own magazine that's exclusively dedicated to gem cutting, and this is Lapidary Journal. So he starts Lapidary Journal in 1947. Lapidary Journal only stopped printing during the pandemic. So this is a magazine that went through many, many editors and many, many iterations, but this is such an important thing that really shared all the new developments, the new machines, the new techniques, the new localities that were people going out to find stones. And because of all of this, all of the eyes that are on Lapidary Journal, they really help people come together to start new clubs, to form communities, and really bring us into this golden age of American faceting. So this is kind of where I'm going to leave us today. If we had 2 more hours, I would take you all the way up to today, but I don't think we're ready for that quite yet. So just to finish this, this story, I kind of want to just leave it at a little bit of gratitude and thanks for these pioneers that really helped create this community that we find today. So if you guys go out through the Tucson show and you see whether they be amateur or pro gem cutters who have their machines set up here or are selling their stones, all of that stuff can be directly linked back to just a couple of people. So we got Lauren Merrill up in Maine, who was a miner turned cutter. He wanted to develop his own faceting machine, and he was the first person to ever do this with angles and indexes and all the modern controls. Then we've got Frank Albion Marcher down in Southern California with the Marcher Brothers shop. He's developing new machines and putting his new faceting styles directly into the store so that customers can see them and buy them and get interested. We've got Peter Zodak writing for Rocks and Minerals in upstate New York, spreading the love of mineral collecting and gem cutting. We've got Frank Wade, who's helping all these guys understand the science behind what they're doing by writing books about gemology. We've got J. Harry Howard, who's the #1 most important influencer of this time, putting out magazines, books, articles, and writing letters to anybody and everybody that would talk to him. We've got Dr. H.C. Dake up in Portland along with Fred Young, who are writing the mineralogists and really pushing the art of faceting forward with all of the research and all of the experimentation that they're doing in their laboratory, and then all the articles that are publishing about it. And finally, maybe most importantly, or at least very influentially, we've got Leland Quick down in LA, who's writing Lapidary Journal and takes us from the early days of American gem cutting all the way into the 21st century by bringing us together through Lapidary Journal. So really, almost every gem cutter in America today who's using these modern types of machines, we have to thank these guys for doing everything that they did to allow us to be here today. So with that being said, I want to thank them. Mostly importantly, I want to thank you guys and thank the AGTA for letting me come and talk to you guys today. This has been Pioneering the American Faceting Movement. I'm Justin K Prim, and I think I'm totally out of time. So thank you guys. By the way, I have a book for sale. If you're interested, you want to come talk to me, I'll be back there somewhere. So thank you guys.
Do we have time for 2 questions?
2 questions if anybody's got them. Yeah.
What is the relationship between this cutting movement and the work of Marcel Tolkowski?
That is a good question. So if we go back to the beginning of the talk, remember I was talking about Henry Morse. So Henry Morse starts a new company to cut diamonds in Boston. And so he's trying to take this idea of using modern scientific ideas about optics and new technology. And so he develops this new what they start calling the scientific cut. He's the first one to do it, but he's only doing it through trial and error. So he starts doing that in the 1880s. Fast forward to like 1915, we've got Tolkowski, who I think was a grad student or something at that time. So basically what he's done is write this treatise, which today, if you look through like the GIA history of how this story happens, it all goes back to Tolkowski and his book, because he proves all these theorems mathematically. What's the most optically efficient diamond? He does it all mathematically. But the way that he did that was by looking at Morse's stones, and he actually had some of Morse's stones and was collaborating, or at least corresponding with him, measuring those stones and then retroactively proving what Morse had already figured out mathematically. So today when we think about early diamond cutting history and of the modern round brilliant, we think Tolkowski, but really we need to also be thinking about Morse, because it was really Morse developed through trial and error and through his diamond cutting factory, and then Tolkowski proved it through scientific and mathematical theorems. So I'm not sure if we can say one's more important than the other, but we definitely need to give Morse a little bit more recognition that he does, because Tolkowski couldn't have done it without Morse, but I think without Tolkowski we wouldn't have been able to do a lot of the other stuff that happened later. So yeah, good question. One more? Anybody?
I think we're good.
Cool. Okay. Well, if anybody wants to talk, see you back there.